Good morning, everybody. I'm Lisa Armoni, and I'm the director of the Rose Project at Jewish Federation of Orange County. And I want to welcome you to our latest webinar in our series, exploring the ramifications of a change in the legal status in parts of the West Bank or Judea and Samaria by the Israeli government. In this series, we seek to provide an educational platform on this important and controversial issue by bringing in a range of voices and by examining it through different perspectives. The Rose Project is a resource for Israel education in our Jewish and broader Orange County community. Our programs seek to engage the community across the age spectrum. When dealing with a subject on which there are strong differences of opinion, we believe in providing a platform for values-based discourse. Our explorations are based on the idea that by hearing diverse views, we can add to our own knowledge as we learn from one another, and can thereby remain in community with one another despite our disagreements. Before we get started today, I'd like to just go over a few housekeeping items. If you've been with us in the past, you know already, but I'm going to repeat them for those who are new. At any time during the webinar, you can submit questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your control panel. After the presentation, I'll address your questions to our speaker, and we'll do our best to answer as many as we can. We are recording this webinar and we'll be happy to share the recording with you after the event. You'll also find a link to it on our website, www.jewishoc.org, along with our previous webinars in this series. And we're live streaming right now on Facebook. For those of you on our webinar last week, we heard from Jerusalem Post political analyst Gil Hoffman that July 1st had come and gone. July 1st being the day that was much anticipated as the day that the coalition government said it could begin to engage in or bring forth legislation around this issue of what some people are calling annexation, others are calling extension of sovereignty, others are calling changing the legal status. And yet Gil said that no action had been taken in Jerusalem to introduce any kind of legislation. And yet a number of things have happened since then. Israel is unfortunately in the midst of a significant increase in coronavirus cases, and much of the attention is focused there. Meanwhile, over the weekend, the Blue and White Party, which is the party of Defense Minister Benny Gantz and Foreign Minister Gabi Ashkenazi, both of whom are former chiefs of staff of the Israel Defense Force, and are partners in the coalition government, the Blue and White Party collapsed in the polls and have since come back to their prior condition for annexation, which means no annexation until COVID is under control and only within the context of the Trump plan. And yet, even without any Israeli steps towards annexation, security cooperation between Israel and the Palestinian Authority has broken down, which has the potential for dangerous consequences. So what will happen moving forward remains anyone's guess. And with that, today we're going to shine a new light, add a new lens to our exploration by looking at the role of the Jordan Valley for American, Israeli, and Middle Eastern regional security. And we have a wonderful speaker to share his perspective with us and the perspective of his organization, Dr. Michael Makovsky. Dr. Makovsky is the president and CEO of the Jewish Institute for National Security of America. Some of you may know it as JINSA, which he joined in 2013. JINSA is dedicated to educating congressional, military, and civilian national security decision makers on American defense and strategic interests, primarily in the Middle East, which the cornerstone of which is a robust U.S.-Israeli security cooperation, according to JINSA. Dr. Makovsky is a U.S. national security expert. He's worked extensively on U.S. policy towards Iran's nuclear program, Israel, and the broader Middle East, as well as the intersection of international energy markets and politics with U.S. national security. From 2016 to 2013, Dr. Makovsky was the Foreign Policy Director for the Bipartisan Policy Center, and before that he served as a special assistant in the Office of the Secretary of Defense and was Director of Essential Services in the Washington office of the Coalition Provisional Authority, the post-war allied entity that governed Iraq advising senior defense, national security council, and energy officials on Iraqi and Middle Eastern energy policy. So we have a whole lot of things that we could talk to Dr. Makovsky about moving forward, but today we'll focus on the Jordan Valley. So, Michael, much of the debate around annexation or sovereignty extension that we've heard so far, and that really seems to be the focus of Congress and concerned stakeholders, is focused on the possible ramifications of the areas where there are Jewish communities over the Green Line, and what are the possibilities of the ramifications, implications for change of status there. So you're really bringing to us a whole new angle that we haven't heard before, and we look forward to hearing your presentation. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Michael. The Zoom is yours.
Okay. Thank you very much. Could you hear me okay? Okay.
I hear you fine.
All right. Thank you, Lisa, and I appreciate very much your having me. I really have to say, as you gave a very nice introduction, I'm not referring to myself, but I commend the Jewish Federation of Orange County for doing this, because I think I commend you for offering different sides of this, because I find it interesting that in this particular issue, the conversation has been overwhelmingly dominated by the critics of what they call annexation, what we call extending sovereignty or extending civil law or incorporation, all these very sort of awkward words or phrases. And so I commend the Federation for wanting to give another side, because I don't think the other side has been out there as much. In fact, the reason why we engage this and you in our organization is very focused on U.S. national security. We particularly we specialize in particular on U.S.-Israel security issues. We have generally stayed away from the Palestinian issue, the peace process, as people call it a lot, because I don't see that as, we haven't seen that as really integral to U.S. national security. It's an important issue, obviously, but from a security standpoint, it's less, I think, important. So we have stayed away. But we decided to engage this issue from a security standpoint, and which is why we focus on the Jordan Valley, which we'll discuss in a minute. But also, I think we thought it was important to offer at least what we hope is seen as a thoughtful, divergent viewpoint from what I see as the overwhelming consensus. Even an issue, I've been thinking about this lately, Iran is a big issue for us. The nuclear issue has been. And even on the 2015 Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA, I found that there was a real range of views that are discussed. And I mean, even in the pro-Israel community. On this particular issue, what we're talking about today, now I haven't seen that. So I hope that those of you who have joined in the call will see this as a useful conversation, and I look forward to a real conversation about it. But I'll say a few words about how we see this. Now, and I would say one more thing before I get in. While we're taking a different side from, I think, where a lot of, even let's just say the pro-Israel views are, obviously the anti-Israel views, that's a whole nother thing. We have a lot of respect for the critics. As I said, I think they've been dominating the conversation. I give them credit for succeeding to do that. But I think we just have to look at this dispassionately. I think they make a lot of good points. I hope to address some of them. If I miss some, I hope you'll ask me about them and I could address them. But I recognize this is a legitimate issue, but I think they're legitimate views on both sides, and let's just kind of dispassionately discuss them. Now, as I said, we're addressing only the Jordan Valley. The discussion in the debate has involved up to 30% of, or let's just say what the critics, I don't mean that in a pejorative way, but it's just like to use a one-word answer, to use one word, what the critics might call annexation, It involves up to 30% of the West Bank, more heavily populated areas. There hasn't been really much discussion so much on the Jordan Valley, which is also important why we wanted to discuss this, not only because we think it's important for U.S. security, but because it's been kind of obscured or actually kind of minimized or even ignored completely in this discussion. We focus on the Jordan Valley. Now, what is the Jordan Valley? Well, you know, before I get into that deeply, I want to just step back for 1 minute or 2 minutes just to kind of contextualize, I think, where we are in the region, and then we'll dig down into this particular issue. I wanted to say that broadly, where I see things in the region is, and this is relevant to the discussion, is you have in America, which is retrenching from the Middle East, or that seeks to retrench from the Middle East. Whether it's the Democratic Party or the Republican Party, that is the trend. That is where we are. That is where we're going. That's where we have been going, including under President Obama. That's where we are, and President Trump, and whoever is president after November, that's the trajectory, whether it's Biden or Trump, that's where we're heading. In such a situation, but the U.S. still has vital strategic interests in the Middle East. Just because we're retrenching doesn't mean we don't have interest. Certainly with COVID, there'll be an increasing focus on China, which means more focus on Asia, which means we'll be more focused with our forces with Asia. But I think that we still have very important interests in the region, and I'm happy to discuss them later if people have questions about how I see it, at least. In such a situation, but certainly it's in the vital U.S. security interest that Iran, that their aggression be pushed back, that they don't achieve nuclear weapons, that they don't achieve nuclear weapons capability. I think there is bipartisan support about how you go about that, like with the Iran nuclear deal, or whether that was a good idea or not. We happen to think it was a very bad idea, but you know, there are those who thought it was a good idea, but there's a consensus you don't want Iran to get there to that point. And then, and I can't see any interest on both sides of the aisle. You know, there's an interest in containing Iranian aggression and containing Islamic extremism, whether it's on the Sunni side, such as ISIS and Al-Qaeda, and I think Muslim Brotherhood, or it's on the Shia side, like the Iranians and their proxies like Hezbollah. That is not in our interest. You want to minimize those forces, and you want more regional stability. But if we're retrenching, we're going to have less influence to try to advance those interests directly. Therefore, I think Israel has been playing and is going to play going forward an even greater role in advancing U.S. interests. They're doing it for their own interests, of course, but their interests align with ours, as I think they do overwhelmingly on a lot of issues. So I think I wouldn't call Israel a proxy of the United States, but I would say that they're increasingly, I'm not, more like an indispensable partner in the region, because frankly, they're the only ones rolling back the Iranians based on reports, as you might have followed, with explosions in the Natanz nuclear reactor last Thursday, which were attributed to Israel. They're doing things against the Iranian nuclear program. That's in our interest, and they're the ones playing it much more consistently, much more directly than we are. So I think, therefore, Israeli security, because I think they're advancing our interests more, and they're going to continue to, is especially especially important, even more so than it was, let's say, last year or the year before or 5 years ago, that their security be protected. It's always been an important interest in the United States, but I think it's even more so now. And that's the general context, how we look back at this issue, because we think it's vital that Israel retain permanent control of the Jordan Valley. It is Israel's longest border, and it's a vulnerable border if certain things would change. And we think it's important to bolster Israel's security. And Israel cannot play the role that it's important for the U.S. to play, for Israel to play for U.S. interests, if they are not secure in their longest border. And that's important for Israel, and it's also important for Jordan, which is also an important American ally in the region. So that's why we think this is a U.S. interest issue. Now, let me talk about the Jordan Valley. Now, Alexandra, I appreciate it, all our interactions together. If you could just show for a second the map with the purple. Oh, well, that's the regional map. Thank you. And I meant to ask you to do that. I'm sorry. While I was talking about the regional issues, but you see where Israel fits in. Of course, sure, almost all you know it. You see Jordan to the east. You see the long border in the east. You see Syria and Lebanon in the north, Iraq, Iran, and you got little Israel there, and you see all the Gulf countries in the southeast there, and how important, not only when I said Israel's advancing U.S. interests, they're obviously advancing the interests of the Gulf, our Gulf Arab partners like Saudis and the UAE and so on. Can we go to the next map, which has there, perfect. This actually, to give proper attribution, is from the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. It's actually, I'll even say it's my older brother who actually did this map. He's a real specialist. My brother and I don't always, while we get along very well on a personal level, we have disagreements on some issues. And anyway, he did this map, and I think it's a terrific map. And you see the part in purple, which shows you really more the Jordan Valley. Now, in this, and we'll keep that map up, it is the 15% of the West Bank. It represents 15% of the landmass, minus the ancient town of Jericho, which is not being considered when it comes to extending sovereignty there. And it also only includes 9,000 Palestinians and about 15,000 Israelis. That's it. That's why this issue is very different than when you're talking about the settlement blocks or different Jewish settlements and Palestinian cities and so on. The Jordan Valley is almost like a separate entity in the sense that it's sparsely populated. This isn't, you don't have the same political issues here or moral issues or sentimental issues with the Jordan Valley that you might have with other parts of the West Bank. And I think that's very important to keep in mind. And by the way, those stats came from my brother as well. I think that now let's get to this. We could go to the 3D map, please, Alexandra. There you go, perfect. Now you can see the depth of the valley. It extends south to the Dead Sea. It extends north. In fact, the Jordan Valley is part of a great rift that starts, I believe, in Lebanon, goes all the way, I think, into Africa. I think Mozambique or something like that. It's a long valley. It's a crevice in the Earth's topography, and you could see the mountains on both sides of the valley. On the east, on the Jordan side, and on the west, on the Israeli side. Of course, you also see Syria in the northeast and Lebanon. Look how close Amman and Jerusalem are to the valley. You can see Amman is only 20 miles east. You see Jerusalem is, I think, 18 miles to the west. Needless to say, in beautiful Orange County, and I've been there a few times, but not enough. And I've driven from LA to Irvine, for instance. It's a lot longer distance, I believe, than the Jordan Valley is to either Amman or Jerusalem. So we're talking about a small territory here. Now, when you see it, the map like this, and look at Tel Aviv, obviously, which is 35 miles to the west, you could see why this is such an important strategic area, I think. And it's Israel's only defensible eastern border. And before I get into why, let me quote you something that the great Yitzhak Rabin, as I'm sure all of you who know, and is globally revered for his peacemaking. A month before he was assassinated in one of the great tragedies of Israel, in 95, his last speech to the Knesset, he said that he spoke about a sustainable peace required, quote, the security border of the state of Israel will be located in the Jordan Valley in the broadest meaning of that term. Any Israeli military people that I know, and I just read you a quote from Rabin, recognize that strategically Israel needs to control the Jordan Valley in terms of the valley itself and the western part of it, obviously not the eastern side, which is Jordan. It is a buffer for Israel from attacks from the east. Uh, you could have Iranian proxy attacks from the east, from Syria, from Iraq, going through Jordan, going through the valley. And if Israel had relinquished that control, defending those attacks would be much harder. Most importantly, I think even more importantly, I should say, um, it's not just about foreign armies going through Jordan. What if there is instability in Jordan? Now, the Hashemite kingdom and the current king, King Abdullah II, is an important ally of the United States. It's vital that he maintain that control. But as we have seen in the Middle East, let's say, certainly since the, whatever you want to call it, Arab awakening, well, I don't think anybody calls it Arab Spring anymore. Things in the Middle East could change, like that. And we saw Egypt turn very quickly in 2011 from a long-standing partner of the United States and Israel to where you had a Muslim Brotherhood government who which ideologically was hostile to Israel and to the West. We see, unfortunately, in Syria, the carnage that we've seen since 2011 in the civil war there. I mean, Assad controls Damascus, he controls parts of Syria, but it's far from a stable state. We see demonstration constantly in Lebanon, which is controlled by Hezbollah. We see Iraq demonstrations and obviously continued sectarian conflict and tremendous Iranian dominance and so on. Things could change in the Middle East very quickly, politically, unfortunately. So we're glad that King Abdullah's in power in Jordan, but that could change very quickly. He's got a lot of enemies. You have the Muslim Brotherhood. You have Al-Qaeda. Look, most of the country is Palestinian. And it wouldn't be far-fetched to see a Palestinian revolt. Some of you might recall or know of in 1970, actually Yasser Arafat did try to do just that, called Black September, and actually Israel helped stave and help protect the King Hussein then. Jordan could be very unstable, unfortunately. It already has a lot of problems, tremendous amount of immigrants from Syria and Iraq. How he stays in power, I frankly don't know. And I'm glad he is. He's certainly a more moderate and stable, moderating force in the region. But if King Abdullah would fall and the Hashemite kingdom would fall, it would be a disaster for Israel. And you could have on their border a very hostile country. So that is another concern. On the other side of the aisle, you have the West Bank. And you have Abbas in charge of the Palestinian Authority. I believe he's on his 12th year of his 4-year term. Nobody knows what's going to happen once he dies. Some people think, well, if Israel, I mean, Hamas could easily take over. A lot of folks think now that if it wasn't for the IDF, that Hamas would be in charge in the West Bank, just like they kicked out the Palestinian Authority in Gaza. And you could obviously see a great deal of turmoil in the Palestinian Authority. So it's not just an issue of what instability in Jordan could affect what's west of the Jordan Valley. You could have instability in the West Bank and tremendous instability, actually. And it could affect Jordan, even if the Hashemites are in charge still in Jordan. The last thing they want is to have Palestinian entity next to it. They want the IDF there. They might not say that publicly, but everybody knows that. So that's another important reason that Israel, ensuring that Israel maintain permanent control of the Jordan Valley not only helps protect it from possible instability and extremism that could occur in Jordan, we hope it doesn't, but it also could protect the Hashemite kingdom, if they stay in power, which we hope it does, from instability in the West Bank, from the Palestinian, whether it's Palestinian Authority, whether it's a Palestinian state, whatever that is or will be, it's certainly not a stable situation. And even the current Palestinian Authority is a sponsor of terror, so it could be a lot worse. I think so. We think permanent control is necessary for Israel. It's important for Jordan. Therefore, it's also important for the United States. Um, Now, let's get to why sovereignty. I just want to explain first why Israel needs to maintain permanent control. Now, one of the arguments of the critics is that the status quo is fine. Israel's been controlling the Jordan Valley since 1967 for 53 years. Why change this in this sort of situation? Why extend sovereignty and upset the Palestinians and upset the Jordan king and the UAE and the Saudis and folks in Europe and many folks here? Why do that? The status quo is sustainable. Well, we think actually the status quo is challenging. It's uncertain, and it has costs, and we worry about it. And I'll give you a few quick examples. And There have been a number of peace attempts over the last 20 years that basically call for peace plans that call for Israel withdrawing from the Jordan Valley. Let me just mention the most recent one, which was when Obama was president, when Kerry was Secretary of State. There was the Allen Plan. General Allen is now the head of Brookings Institute, but he devised a plan. It relied on defense technology without IDF forces on the ground. It relied on Palestinian forces, on U.S. forces. Frankly, the idea that technology could defend a border has never been proven anywhere and is completely unsustainable based on the generals that we've consulted with in Israel and in America. And we don't do it in the United States. And the idea of relying on foreign forces, the idea of having American forces in the West Bank, I think would be awful for Israel, awful for the United States. But Israel has had a terrible experience with relying on foreign forces, on international peacekeepers. Look at Lebanon. There have been peacekeepers there for decades. There was a renewed focus after the Second Lebanon War in 2006. How's that going? Well, let's see. Hezbollah had 10,000 rockets in 2006 at the end of that war, and now they got about 130,000 rockets and missiles. So not very good. The UN peacekeeping forces do nothing there. They didn't know that for 10 years, Hezbollah was building these humongous tunnels underneath from Lebanon into Israel. So I can't imagine any Israeli general or anyone who focuses on Israel's security relying on international peacekeepers. It goes against the DNA of Israel anyway to defend itself by itself. I use this last example. You saw this with Clinton. You even saw it under Bush when Olmert was prime minister. But the peace plans the peace plans that we have seen generally involve Israel relinquishing control of the Jordan Valley. So we think it's important that Israel actually, and one value of the Trump plan, whatever you think about it, is that it actually has Israel retaining its strategic points, including the Jordan Valley. So, and I'll add one last thing. And you might say, well, Israel rejected that, so why not? So, okay, so what's so bad? I think the Kerry plan, of course, was actually Abbas that said he'd get back to Obama, and I think he's still waiting. I think the White House is still waiting for Abbas to come back. But Israel certainly was not that enthusiastic about the Allen plan. I think that you also had, in the end of the Obama administration, UN Security Council Resolution 2334, which basically referred to all of the territories on the other side of the Green Line, including the Western Wall, the Kotel, as Palestinian, Mount Olives. As far as I know, Vice President Biden has not disavowed himself from that. That was a pretty shocking thing that happened in December. Of course, technically the United States abstained, but everyone knows that the administration was behind it. This isn't meant as a partisan attack. My point is that going forward, whether it's a Republican or a Democratic administration, these issues are not going to die. And Israel resistance to these things have been often costly to Israel and its diplomatic ties come under a lot of pressure. Its position in world opinion. We think that peace plans going forward are going to continue to focus on this sort of thing. And therefore, it's best to enshrine is permanent Israeli control of the Jordan Valley by extending sovereignty. Now, and I'll try to wrap up in just a few more minutes. It took me a little longer to say all this than I expected. People might say, well, give it up. This has been said before. Israel could relinquish the control, but then they could come back. People said the same thing when Israel withdrew from southern Lebanon. By the way, it doesn't mean that they weren't right to withdraw from southern Lebanon. The same thing was said when Sharon withdrew from Gaza. And it was also said during in the 90s about Oslo peace process, about the West Bank. It's not so easy to go back in a territory that you've relinquished. Take Sharon, who was known as a daring a warrior and also a daring peacemaker, and certainly by the end of his life. But it took him in the Second Intifada a year and a half since the Intifada started in, I think, late September 2000 till a year and a half later, of the spring of 2002, to go in to Jenin and other places where the Intifada, and it took Israel 2 years to really stop the Intifada and clean up. And, as some of you know, the second Intifada cost about 1,000 Israeli lives, which is a tremendous amount. It also cost Palestinian lives. So we think you don't want to relinquish control, you want to enshrine it. Here's an opportunity now with the Trump plan, which supports Israeli extending sovereignty to Jordan Valley to enshrine this permanent control. There's also overwhelming Israeli support for this, certainly in the Knesset. And it actually gets to something I said at the beginning when I was commending the Federation for hosting this. There's a lot more diversity of opinion in Israel than there is in America about this subject. And it's almost flipped. Here, there seems like, based on the public discussion, overwhelming opposition. Of course, you have JINSA and us and a few others opposed. In Israel, you have a majority of the Knesset that support extending sovereignty, but not just to the Jordan Valley, but other parts of that 30% of the West Bank. But this is something where there's more consensus in Israel about. It's not, wouldn't be so, it would be hard for a future Israeli government to overturn this. I could talk about the legal issue. I think I'm going to skip that for now. I think I want to conclude by just addressing a couple more points and just addressing just a few more criticisms of the critics of extending sovereignty. Now, again, the critics of the so-called critics, as for a shorthand, they have reasonable views. Their point about why change the status quo, I think, is a reasonable thing to ask. As I explained, I think it is important to do so. The other criticisms that have come is, well, you'll upset the Jordan king. He worries that this could hurt him domestically, that he'll cool the peace with Israel. The UAE, some of you might have saw that the UAE ambassador here was really an excellent rock star ambassador here in Washington, wrote an op-ed in Yediot, in an Israeli publication, saying, don't do this. But I don't know if some of you, that it could stall warming ties between Israel and the Gulf Arab countries, which has been a terrific development in recent years. But I don't know if some of you saw this, but in the New York Times, I think about 2 weeks after he wrote that op-ed, or 10 days, I can't remember exactly, there was a report that Israel and the UAE are going to be cooperating on combating COVID-19. So apparently, the interest between the Gulf Arab countries on a range of issues is going to lead these countries to still work together. So my point is, I think that, my point is that it could hurt in the short term. It might hurt relations with Jordan. It might upset, might trigger some unrest in the Palestinians. It was certainly, the Gulf Arab countries have been publicly against this. We see these as generally short-term and manageable problems because we think these entities will be, their interests will predominate. And I think that for the Gulf Arab countries, they care the most about Iran. They also care about combating COVID-19 and other things. But for them, they're close to, they've been working close to Israel, not because they're Zionists, but because they have a lot of mutual interests. And that's been clear in recent years. So we think that's going to continue. There might be some bumps in the road. Jordan cannot cut off its ties with Israel. It might cool the peace, but I don't think the king could stay in power, or power, at least you could say his power becomes shakier without close security cooperation between the two countries. Also, the economic relations, selling Jordan natural gas at below market rates, and other economic ties. The same thing with the Palestinian Authority. I don't think Abbas would be in power without the IDF. He's certainly never going to say that. And the security relationship between the two entities, the Palestinian Authority and Israel, is, again, not because Abbas is a Zionist by any means, but because it's in the Palestinian Authority's interest to maintain that security. So there could be some bumps, and I'm not trying to minimize them. Those are serious concerns, but we think overall it's more important to enshrine permanent Israeli control of the Jordan Valley and use this opportunity that you have right now to do so. Let me say one last thing, and I'll end here. Another criticism, and it has to be with the peace process, that this is going to hurt the peace process. And again, I think it's a legitimate control. Abbas has been strongly against it. He's warned of another intifada. It might happen. You don't know. But Israel can't do everything. It has to follow its own interests. However, we actually think this would advance. We have a different view on that. We think it would advance the peace process to the extent that there is a peace process. The fact that there's I think anyone who follows this and who works on it, and there are many people who've done that a lot longer, certainly, than I have. I don't know of many who think that peace is imminent between the Palestinians and the Israelis, or a peace agreement. I can't even imagine it happening in the near term. It didn't happen under Obama, it didn't happen under Bush, it didn't happen under Clinton. It's not going to happen under Trump. Right now, I don't see it happening unless there's certainly a change of leadership on the Palestinian Authority. Therefore, we think, just like moving the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem was also a positive, because we think that what the peace process needs is more reality. Most, I don't know the exact percentage, but is it 95% of Israelis believe, or I don't know any Israeli doesn't believe they need to retain at least Western Jerusalem as Israel's capital. And there's overwhelming consensus, certainly, on the Jordan Valley. And I think there's no way that any future Israeli government would ever relinquish control, I think, of the Jordan Valley, except maybe under tremendous pressure, but I can't see that either. And I think that we have a sort of distorted view of what's realistic here, I think, versus what's realistic in the region. And I can't imagine any Israeli government going forward relinquishing Jordan Valley control. So we think it's important to injecting more realism into the peace process, to the extent that there is one, and to improve the very slender chances of a peace agreement in any foreseeable future. We think it's good to inject some reality. I want to say that not because I'm against. I think everyone, we all want to have some agreement on this. It's very important. But you could see, as you could see by what has happened to the Labor Party, where the political debate is in Israel, where the political debates have been in the last few elections between blue and white and, let's say, Likud on the peace process, which is really not very substantive, actually. It's much more stylistic. You could see where Israel is. And so I think so we think having more realism in the peace process, which extending sovereignty to the Jordan Valley would do, could only enhance the chances of a peace agreement, which we all want, between Israel and the Palestinians. So that's our view. I'll stop right here. I think I kept to the time that I was given, and I'll turn it over to Lisa. And thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Michael. Thank you for your really comprehensive and fascinating presentation. And we will be sharing the link to the JINSA report with participants in our follow-up email. I want to ask a couple of questions. First of all, and I think actually some of them you addressed for me already. I was going to ask about how King Abdullah might withstand pressure from his own people if this were to happen, and I think you addressed that. But I also want to talk about Israel's European allies, and even some of its American allies. We're seeing letters in Congress encouraging Israel not to not to extend sovereignty or to annex any part of the territory. And I think the argument is sort of in broad strokes. I mean, there's sort of we don't see right now any kind of distinction being made between annexation of the Jewish communities or of the Jordan Valley. Do you think that there's a distinction being made? Is there talk about that at least quietly? So first of all, I guess that's my first question is there any kind of, do you anticipate them making sort of a distinction now or in the future? And secondly, if Israel were to extend its sovereignty in the Jordan Valley and this were not recognized by Israel's allies, would it matter?
Yeah. Okay. It's a good point. Good questions. By the way, first on the King Hussein question you mentioned at the beginning, in a perverse sort of way, it's possible that this could help him by being so vocal against this and then cooling the peace with Israel. It might actually bolster him a bit internally for standing up, and addressing some of the critics. I do find I'm not an expert on Jordanian internal politics. There's others certainly know a lot more than I do, but he's got a lot of things he has to balance, and this actually might help him in a way for standing up. And but we'll see. Obviously, it's vital for Israel and for the United States that he stays in power. On the issue of the Europeans, you're right. Obviously, although I think that if Israel did what the Europeans wanted or the EU did it, Israel would have it'd be a very different Israel. I certainly don't think Israel could follow what the dictates of the European EU. Certainly on, let's say, the Iran nuclear deal, you have, European capitals were strongly support maintaining the JCPOA, and obviously Israel hasn't. They have a different view, certainly. And by the way, it's not just Netanyahu. It's actually there's a spectrum. I mean, it's the consensus, I think, of Israeli officials on that. So I don't think Israel, unfortunately, they can't have their policy dictated by Brussels and London and Paris, unfortunately, but they obviously want to have a close relationship. On the issue of the Democrats, I see those letters you mentioned. Obviously, some have gone more extreme, like the Ocasio-Cortez, the AOC letter, and so on about tying this to aid. I don't think that's going to happen. My own view, I think of some of the things going on in the Democratic Party about Israel have more to do with the Democratic Party that have to do with Israel. I don't know if this is really going to change where things are going or not going. But again, I think it's more important, and people here in America, I'm in Washington, here in Washington, elsewhere, are not focusing enough on what's going on inside Israel. Most of the Knesset supports this. As I said, there's virtually no Labor Party. More, in fact, the guy who headed the Labor Party is in the coalition right now with Netanyahu, Peretz, Amir Peretz. The Blue and White is not a left-wing party. It is a centrist party. Of course, as you mentioned correctly, even Blue and White seats, polls have been going down lately, and I think there was a poll that was around 8 or 9 seats. So it's a far cry from what he had before. But I think there's there's overwhelming consensus on a lot of fundamental security issues in Israel. And as much as I don't like to see what some of the things, whether it's in Republicans or in Democrats, some of the rhetoric, you could have proper disagreement between countries, and that's fine. But when it gets a little far and you start mixing up issues like tying U.S. military assistance to Israel with this, it's like someone said to me we would base our policy with Britain on Britain's policy with Northern Ireland. It's just preposterous to me. I don't think it's, and I'm not even talking about morally, I'm not talking about sentimentally, I'm just talking about a pure American national security interest. I think it's not the right thing. I think it's unfortunate, but I think, again, the main thing I think we need to focus on, because I see here and in Israel almost completely different discussions. And I think Americans need to be a little more sensitive about what the realities are in Israel. And it should say something to Americans that what has happened to the Labor Party. And I think, what does that mean? And Israel has experienced different things with Intifada, with the 3 wars with Gaza, what they withdrew from there, they withdrew from southern Lebanon. They get 100,000, 130,000 rockets and missiles facing them from Hezbollah and southern Lebanon. I just think Israelis have learned different things, and I think Americans should be a little more appreciative of it.
I'm seeing there have been a number of questions regarding the sort of relationship between an extension of sovereignty in Jordan and pressure to annex or to extend sovereignty over the Jewish communities in Judea and Samaria, and specifically given where a lot of the pressure is coming from within Israel to extend sovereignty. Do you think that if Israel were to experiment first with extending sovereignty in the Jordan Valley, do you think that would exacerbate tensions within Israel, particularly from the settler communities who might not be satisfied, right, with just extension in the strategic area, but not seeing perhaps the Israeli government not being responsive to their needs or demands?
Yeah, it's good. By the way, and I apologize, Lisa, I didn't address your question about separating Jordan Valley, so I'll do it now. I'm sorry. I would, but you're right. The settler community is critical of, you have settlers community that is very critical of the Trump plan. You have, obviously, it's been criticized here on the left. In Israel, you had Benny Gantz, head of Blue and White, when he was running, when he had 34 seats or whatever they got after the last election, some 33, 34. Of course, he's down to maybe, he supported the Trump plan. But you had the settlers oppose it because they didn't because actually the Trump plan calls for a 2-state solution, calls for a Palestinian state, and they don't like that. So you're right. I think I'm glad you brought that issue up. I was remiss in not bringing that up. But I think that I would start with the Jordan Valley. Politically, though, it might not be what Netanyahu is the most focused on. I would, because I think that's where the consensus is in Israel more. I think the military overwhelmingly would want to support it. Israelis understand the importance of it. And as I said at the beginning, there's only 9,000 Palestinians and only 15,000 Israelis. If you take out Jericho, which is not part of the annexation, the extending of sovereignty plan. So you don't have these issues that you have with other parts of the West Bank. So I would, but I don't think that's what they're doing. But so I don't have the same political concerns that Netanyahu has. And I might, if I was prime minister, I might have different concerns than he does. But I would start with where there's more of a consensus. That's what I would do. I do think this will be done in stages, probably. By the way, I forgot to say one thing, and I should have said it in my discussion. The term annexation, the reason why we don't use it is because the term usually means that a country is taking over another sovereign's territory. But in our view, there is no other entity that has a real legitimate claim to sovereignty over this area, and that Israel has the more legitimate claim. So it's not like taking over, or when people use the term annexation with the Golan Heights, which had been Syrian before. Here, it's a different situation. So we use the term extending sovereignty, or incorporation, or extending civil law. Sorry. Okay.
And with regard to whether Israel's allies are making the distinction. Right?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, sorry. Thank you. No, I don't think so. Everything's been kind of, you know, I would say most of the debate has not been on the Jordan Valley. It's all about the territorial, the issue, the other 15% of the 30%. So uh, the idea of extending sovereignty Netanyahu is talking about is 30% of the West Bank. We're talking about half of that, 15% of the West Bank is Jordan Valley. I believe more of the discussion is on the other 15, which is why we also thought it was important to kind of inject this issue.
Great. So there's a couple of questions around the viability of a Palestinian state if Israel were to extend sovereignty in the Jordan Valley. So I'd love to hear your analysis about that. And also a question about, I'm just looking here to see, whether a Palestinian state is in the interest of the United States, the way you understand the issue around the Jordan Valley to be of interest to
Yeah.
the United States.
Well, I don't see it. It's outside the scope of our paper. We don't really address that issue. As I said, the Trump plan calls for a Palestinian state and a two-state solution. By the way, that element of the Trump plan probably has been obscured by other things that people have written or said about it, but that should not be forgotten. Sure, I think if the two parties could come to an understanding that protects Israeli security and gives the Palestinian people, you know, a say over their own affairs, I think it's in the interest. I mean, sure. I don't, the problem is it's hard to, there's a Palestinian state that was a moderate state and wasn't sponsoring terror like the Palestinian Authority does today, uh, and had a different leadership. And I think it would be great for the Palestinian people, which is important on a moral, from a moral standpoint. You know, as long as there's a security standpoint, sure, definitely it's in America's interest. Do I see it in the vital interest of the United States from a security standpoint? I don't see it as a top tier or second tier issue. As long as Israel's security and Jordan security too is very important, they're protected, then I think it's in the U.S. interest. So I just, as I said at the outset, we generally haven't engaged the Palestinian issue because we just don't see it as a top, you know, as a major security concern. I think it has other concerns, as political concerns, as moral consideration. Those are very valid. I'm not trying to minimize those all. It just institutionally we focus on security. So I think it'd be valuable as long as, you know, our existing allies like Jordan and Israel are, but, you know, as long as the two parties agree that protects the security interests of both those countries, I definitely think so. But I see it more as a moral issue, and I'm not minimizing that. Moral concerns are very important. I just see it less as a major security concern for the United States.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you very much. And for those of you whose questions we didn't get to answer today, I apologize. I hope you'll continue to engage. We will send you the report so that hopefully some of your answers you'll find in the much more detailed report that JINSA produced. Michael, I want to say thank you so much for spending an hour with our community and giving us this important insight. And I want to encourage everybody to attend our next webinar, which will be this coming Wednesday afternoon. It's going to be a lunchtime webinar. We're going to experiment with that time. And we'll be hearing a perspective from the Palestinians. Raith Al-Omari from the Washington Institute for Near East Policy is going to be sharing with us the implications for this issue on internal Palestinian dynamics, inter-Arab dynamics, those kinds of things. So another new perspective that we have not engaged so far. So with that, I want to thank you very much again. Thank all the participants for joining us, and we hope to see you again next week.